On the night of the full moon in July, 1937, a Basque sheep herder named Fernando Romila was awakened in his wagon by a strange sound. He was used to living alone under the stars, many miles from the nearest humans, in the company of the 700 sheep he tended, and the 2 nags that drew his cart. He had lived that way for years on the tick-ridden mountain pastures of the Idaho-Montana borderland, and he knew the howls of the timber wolf and the coyote, and the brief noise a sheep makes when a mountain lion sinks his fangs into its throat. The sound he heard that night was unlike any other he had ever heard before. It could have been the cry of a wolf on the prowl, but the full-throated howl of this wild beast had behind it a curious human quality. It was as if it were almost talking. Fernando threw off his blankets. His horses had become restless. They scraped their hoofs and bellowed. The sheep mewed and squealed, and just as Fernando jumped from his caravan wagon, the strange howl turned into a snarl, and one of the sheep gave an agonized bleat. Rifle in hand, Fernando raced toward the sound. He was afraid, but he knew his duty. Sheep bumped into his legs as he ran across the moonlit pasture, as if seeking comfort from his presence. The beast howled again, and Fernando knew it was very close. He raised his rifle. Ahead, dimly outlined in the silver light, he saw a huge, dark shape, at least twice the size of a full-grown timber wolf, squatting on its haunches over a blob of gray, which Fernando recognized as a slaughtered sheep. He fired. The monster did not budge. It howled again, and this time it sounded as if it were laughing. Fernando advanced another few feet, and again he pressed the trigger. Now the beast raised itself and bared its fangs. Desperately, Fernando slammed back the bolt, and he kept on firing until all his rounds were gone. It was quite by accident that Fernando's body was found the next day by Burke Jackson, a cattle driver who was riding back from Henry's Corner to the nearby ranch where he worked. Fernando's head lay severed from his body, mouth open, in a last desperate scream, and his eyes bulging in frozen terror. The torso was ripped open from breastbone to groin, a wide, gaping, dark cavity, and there was nothing inside, just shreds of the tissues that had held his bowels and his organs in place. Jackson noticed that there was surprisingly little blood. It almost seemed as if whatever had killed Fernando had nuzzled down on his open neck and sucked him dry. This was confirmed later by the undertaker at Henry's Corner. Jackson examined the sheep. It too had bled but little, and its belly was torn open also, but the organs were not missing. Jackson found a few tracks. They were those of a wolf, but much larger. The animal would have had to be 7 feet long and weighed 400 pounds to leave prints like that. Jackson got a blanket from Fernando's wagon, bundled up the torso and the head, slung the bundle over his saddle, and rode back to town. He found the peace officer in Kansas Pete's tavern, leaning on the bar and talking with a stranger. "Back mighty quick," the deputy greeted Jackson. "What's the matter, Burke? They kick you out at Dooley's?" Jackson, who was a slow man with words, first downed the whiskey the bartender put in front of him without being asked, and then said, "Not yet, they didn't. Though they might if I don't show up by and by. I come back because that Fernando got himself killed. I got him outside on the horse." Slowly, the deputy drew the story from Jackson, who was as puzzled as ever by his grisly find. "I can't figure what killed him. I never seen no beast that would eat a man's guts, excepting it was a coyote, but coyotes don't come that big. This was even bigger than a wolf." "Say," said the stranger at the bar who had listened to the account, "wasn't it full moon last night?" "Sure," Jackson said. "Could have been a werewolf," the stranger said. "You've heard of werewolves, haven't you? Men that turn into beasts when the moon is full and go out to drink blood and eat hearts. Now don't start laughing," he said when he saw the smiles breaking out on the faces around him. "Just because you never seen a werewolf doesn't prove they don't exist. Of course, werewolves aren't in fashion now, and they always were more popular in Europe, but that doesn't prove anything either. The stranger was a bulky man in a fancy city suit with a wide striped tie. His hair grew low on his forehead, his eyebrows arched in a single span across his deep-set, narrow eyes. When he smiled, he displayed big, yellow teeth, and his breath was so foul that people moved away from him. "Who's that character?" Jackson asked the deputy when they went outside to take Fernando's body to the undertaker's. "Don't know," said the deputy. "He came to town about a week ago and took a room over at the hotel. Spends most of his time at Pete's. Don't know where he gets the money. Well, it's none of my business, so long as he makes no trouble." "He sure is a screwball," said Jackson. The undertaker stitched the head back on Fernando, although there were no relatives around to pay their last respect. And then the sheep herder was buried. After one of the girls ran naked one night from Millie's whorehouse, chased by a drunken ranch hand and into Kansas Pete's saloon, the people of Henry's Corner forgot about Fernando and talked about Millie and her girls instead. By that time, Burke Jackson had long returned to Dooley's Twin Fork Ranch. 1 month passed. The moon waned and grew again, and then shaped full for August. That night, Jackson was snoring in the bunkhouse when, from outside, he heard the unmistakable sound of a stampede. It wasn't a big stampede because most of the cattle were not kept grazing that close to the ranch, but any time you have a couple dozen cattle running in terror, it's a stampede. You hear the earth shaking like thunder, and you better watch out. Jackson and 3 other men rushed outside to their horses. There was no time to saddle them. Jackson grabbed a lariat and jumped on bareback. The cattle were making for the river flats where there was quicksand, and it was head them off or lose them. From far off, Jackson heard a monstrous howl. To him, it sounded as if a giant roared in anger. He galloped toward that sound while the other man rode toward the river, because he suspected that this was where the trouble came from that had alarmed the cattle. He raced through the moonlight. There was no mistaking the direction. He flashed past the corral and down the gentle slope of the home pasture. And as he rode, he still heard the trampling hooves and the yells of the other men toward his right, but already far away. But he also heard the strange howl subside into a snarl, and as he came closer, the sound of smacking lips and sucking. Suddenly before him lay a full-grown steer, and over the body of that animal rose the shape of another, equally as big. Jackson's horse reared up with a shriek. Jackson was almost thrown. He managed to slide off the horse's hind end, and as the horse galloped away, he advanced on the monster and swung his lariat. The beast before him, Jackson thought it was a wolf, but he could not believe its size, was squatting over the fallen steer and sucking on its neck, its huge yellow fangs catching the light of the moon and flashing. It paid no attention to the advancing man. Jackson whirled the rope and threw it. The loop settled over the beast's neck. Its eyes flashed red in the moonlight, and from its throat rose a deep snarl. Jackson pulled in on the rope and braced himself. This was going to be a lot tougher than calf roping, he thought, but surprisingly, he was not really scared. The monster's snarl turned into something like a laugh. Jackson thought it almost sounded human, and the beast rose from the carcass and gaped its jaws at Jackson and rushed forward. Jackson knew then that he had no chance. Just then, the night turned completely dark. A thick cloud had drifted over the moon. Jackson was as a blind man. He could see nothing, and standing there in the blackness, he waited for his death. Suddenly, he felt himself yanked forward. He fell flat on the ground, and then he was pulled along as the beast apparently tried to escape. Jackson hung on. The rope burned his fingers bloody before he got a good hold on it, and he bounced along over rocks, his face grinding in the dust, beset only by the thought that he must catch and kill the beast. He was dragged for several hundred feet, his clothes shredding and his skin rubbing off, and then he was pulled into the forest. And when he banged against a tree, he saw his chance. He wrapped his body around the trunk and then quickly slung the rope around it. The beast howled. The tree bent forward and then snapped back. And as Jackson felt his way forward in the darkness, he heard the monster crashing through the forest, sounding farther and farther away. And his groping hands found the rope and reeled it in. The rope had torn. Jackson limped back to the bunkhouse. What had happened was hard to believe. He examined the rope in the light, It was perfectly good rope, yet the beast had managed to tear it, something not even a full-grown bull can do. And then the other riders came in and told him that altogether 3 head of cattle had been killed by the mysterious raider. The following weekend, Jackson went to Henry's Corner to spend his wages, and in Kansas Pete's he met up with the same stranger who had talked about a werewolf after Fernando's death. After a few drinks, Jackson told him the story of what had happened. "You see," said the stranger, smiling his yellow-toothed smile, "it must be a werewolf, otherwise you'd be dead." "How you figure that?" Jackson said. "You said that a cloud covered the moon just when the wolf was going to attack you, right? Well, any ordinary wolf wouldn't have been stopped by darkness, but a werewolf can only kill by the light of the full moon. So, naturally, he had no choice but to escape." "Sounds like a bunch of hogwash to me," Jackson said. "Something must have scared him off, but we'll see. Maybe I'll get another look at him. I'll set a trap." "How do you figure on doing that?" "I'll stake out a juicy cow and wait for him." "An excellent idea," said the stranger. "But don't lose your sleep doing it every night. You try it the next night of full moon, and you'll see he'll come." "I think you're full of it," Jackson said, "but I guess there's no harm in trying. Last 2 times he did his killing by the full moon, so he might again. I'll be waiting this time." "You do that," said the stranger, grinning. "I'm sure it will be a lot of fun all around. Just be sure you keep the date." Jackson did not like the stranger's smirk. Even half-tied as he was, the man's peculiar manner and animal-like looks made him feel uneasy. He edged away and decided to continue his relaxing over at Millie's. But when he sobered up the next day, he began to have vague thoughts that perhaps the stranger might be right. Jackson was a methodical guy who never liked to do things halfway, and he arranged with Dooley for a couple of days off so he could take a bus to Coeur d'Alene and go to the public library. He read all he could find about werewolves. He didn't find very much, but then he wasn't a very fast reader, and he didn't believe what he read. But the next full moon, he did just as he had planned. He tied a cow to an old corral post at the far end of the property and settled down with his lariat and the old .44 his grandfather had given him when he was 16. The moon did not rise until late that night, and Jackson fell asleep. He was awakened when his horse got restless and started scraping the ground and snorting. The moon was full, and it was already high in the sky. Jackson guessed that it was about 1 o'clock in the morning. The cow, 20 feet from him, was tossing her head and mooing softly. Jackson went into a crouch. The howl was so close it shocked even Jackson. A black shape flashed through the moonlit night. The cow grunted, the beast snarled. And then Jackson heard the grinding of teeth and tearing of flesh as the monster's fangs closed on the cow's neck. The 2 big animal bodies fell together, and then came the sound of sucking. Jackson inched forward. He saw the monster's head nuzzling the neck of the cow, whose legs still twitched feebly. He swung the lariat and tossed. It was a miss. Jackson's hand went to his .44 and snapped it from the holster. The beast had let go of the cow's neck and was looking at him. It bared its teeth and snarled. Again, Jackson thought that mixed with the snarl was the sound of human laughter. For the first time in his adult life, he was really afraid. He raised the revolver and fired. The muzzle blast blinded him, but when he had regained his vision, he saw the black monster stepping over the cow's body. Slowly, setting one foot before the other, it advanced. Jackson fired again, straight into the beast's face. He could not believe that he had missed at such a short distance. He'd been an expert shot ever since he was a kid. His hands shook now, and frantically, he squeezed off one shot after another. Between the blasts, he heard the laughter of the beast as it came forward inexorably. There was no stopping it. The hammer snapped home on an empty chamber. There was a metallic click. An empty revolver couldn't stop the monster where a loaded one had failed. He threw the gun away. His hand hit an old fence post, a rotted piece of wood sticking out of the ground. It was a better weapon than nothing. At least he would fight to the death. Jackson pulled as hard as he could, and the earth yielded up the post. Just then, with a final triumphant laugh, the beast crouched and leapt. It hurtled through the air at Jackson. The cattle driver raised the fence post high and tried to pray. The weight of the beast crushed him. He felt its foul breath against his face, and he waited for the fangs to dig into his throat. Stunned by the impact of the heavy animal body, Jackson took seconds to recover his wits. Instinctively, he pushed his hands against the monster's furry chest, and there was no reaction. Jackson crawled out from under the weight and saw that the beast was dead. The spike end of the fence post had driven straight into its heart as it jumped. From then on, Jackson believed in werewolves and was convinced that this beast was one. As he told everybody afterwards, in the split second, while he had held the fence post raised, he had seen the shadow of a cross cast on the ground by the moonlight. And when he had examined the post afterwards, he had discovered that a small slat was still nailed to it, and that this had given its shadow the shape of a cross. He remembered from his reading in the library that only the shape of a cross could be victorious over a werewolf. The next day, Jackson took a truck, loaded the carcass of the beast on it, and drove to Henry's Corner. He wanted to tell the stranger that he had been right, that he was now convinced. But he had a suspicion that he would not find the stranger. He was right. The stranger had last been seen the evening before, cheerfully leaving Kansas Pete's Tavern, wishing everyone a good night and assuring them that he himself would have one. Everybody thought he'd gone over to Millie's, but she claimed he hadn't been there, and there was no cause for her to lie. His bed at the hotel had not been slept in, and he was never seen again. Jackson took his story to his grave with him when the Japs killed him in World War II on Tarawa, but the werewolf, or whatever it is still there in Henry's Corner, exhibited in a glass cage at the local museum. A huge wolf as big as a steer, but somehow looking like no other wolf that anyone had ever seen.
Sorry for rushing the Halloween season, but if you can forgive me, please like this video, leave a comment, subscribe if you haven't already, and if you really liked it, consider becoming a Patreon supporter. Like all of these incredible people whose names you see here, particularly Andre D., Brake System BSC, Zachary Snowden-Smith, Zanazira, and Michael Fittori. Thank you all for making this exhibit possible, and thank you for being you.